The Boy in the Alamo, Chapter 8, The Siege, continues. Colonel Crockett drove me to cover that night. He said that someone must stand guard over the women, and he could not spare a man. I went to the stone house and took up my post. But my eyelids continued to close. Even the sound of the cannon exploding all night could not make me stay awake. I was a poor sentry. And I was ashamed when I waked up with a start when the sun came through the slit window. Lupe was standing beside me, giggling. I scowled at her. "I want to go outdoors," Lupe whined. "I am tired of this house." So far she had been pretty good. "When it's over we can play again," I said. "You can be the Texian army." "When will it be over?" Lupe asked fretfully. I didn't know what to tell her. Who knows? For breakfast we had tough beef and cold beans. Lupe said she could not swallow it. I ate hers, for I was powerful hungry. When I had finished it, I went to the earthworks. Nobody there had slept. Nobody in the fort had slept all night. There were just enough men to go around. There was nobody to relieve them. During the day, 6 of the volunteers would mount the scaffolding to shoot. 6 would load and pass up the guns, and the other 6 would rest. Colonel Crockett sent me for fresh water. I had a big clay pot with a dipper, and that day I carried fresh water to all the positions. The Mexicans were now on 3 sides of us. During the night, they had massed their cavalry troops where they could cut off any help that might come for our side. Their guns and infantry were on the other 2 sides. Only the south, defended by Colonel Crockett and the Tennessee Volunteers, was clear. For dinner we had beef and corn and beans. We also had it for supper. That's all we had for 12 days. But when you're hungry, it tastes all right. There was no milk for Angelina, and she had to live on tortillas. Mrs. Mendoza pounded the corn and made flat, thin cakes out of it and cooked them on hot stones. The shooting died down some that day, but we had to stay on guard. Some of the men slept with their loaded guns beside them, but nobody left his station. The next morning, that was Friday the 26th of February, Colonel Travis determined to tear down the low buildings between us and the town of San Antonio de Bayar, so that the Mexicans could not creep up behind cover on the fort. Also, he needed the wood for new scaffolding, as some of ours had given way. Part of the chapel was unroofed, and he decided to build scaffolding inside the part without a roof to give us new positions to shoot from. He sent out a dozen men on horseback toward the Mexican cavalry to take their mines off of the buildings before the earthworks. They had a skirmish, and while this went on, a detachment of our troops went out through the main gate and wrecked the buildings. The Mexicans opened fire on them, but they burned several of the buildings and tore down the others and dragged the wood back to the fort. Though the shot and shell hissed through the air, none of our men got hurt. As soon as we got the wood safely inside the walls, we carried it to that part of the chapel open to the sky and began to build new platforms. Inside the chapel, we were able to build a higher lookout so that our watchers could stare out east over the low hills for signs that help might be on the way to us. Even a false alarm would have cheered us. Not knowing whether help was coming or not was almost as hard as being tired and sleepy and hungry and always hearing the sound of the guns. The following day, the Mexican army tried to build a bridge over the river. We watched them until they got all their building stuff on the banks. And then Colonel Crockett opened fire and began to pick them off as if they were quail. There must have been at least 30 who bit the dust. That's an idiom. They left the river and began to run. "Looks like they decided building a bridge was a bad idea," Colonel Crockett joked. We all felt jolly about that until our lookout called, "Third Army of Santa Anna on the horizon." Another column of Mexican soldiers then rode in across the dusty plain. Now they were on all sides of us. On Sunday morning, February 28th, Colonel Travis spoke to the men. I'm afraid none of our messengers has got through, he said. We must have help to survive. We must hang on until it comes. Captain Seguin, will you make the last effort? Captain Juan Seguin was the commander of the Mexican volunteers in the Alamo. He spoke Spanish, so Travis hoped he would be able to fool the Mexicans and get through their lines. I go, Commander, Captain Seguin said, but I have no horse. Our horses had grown smaller and smaller in number as the messengers had ridden off and never came back, and we had lost one or two in a skirmish with the cavalry. Colonel Bowie dragged himself out of bed every day and tried to help out where he could, but he was not there that day. I asked Colonel Bowie, Captain Seguin said. He went to Colonel Bowie's cot and spoke to him. Colonel Bowie's face was burning with the raging fever. He was coughing too, for the fever had been to the fever had been added pneumonia. I wish to borrow your horse to ride as a messenger for help, Colonel, Captain Seguin said. He and Bowie were old friends. Who are you? Colonel Bowie asked him, for he was delirious with fever. I am Juan, Colonel, Juan Seguin. I don't know you. I am a defender of the Alamo, Juan said proudly. Take my horse, Colonel Bowie said. Vaya con Dios. Go with God. Adios, Colonel. Goodbye, Juan said softly, and he touched Bowie's hand. He knew that he might never see his friend again. In the early dawn of February 29th, the year was a leap year in 1836, Captain Seguin and his aide rode out. The captain's soft Spanish got him through the lines, for he was thought to be a Mexican cowboy. But the lookout in the chapel reported that they were stopped by a Mexican cavalry patrol. Just as the patrol came up to them, they spurred their horses forward and dashed away in a rain of Mexican bullets. The weather had turned cold. Here and there, the walls around the plaza were beginning to crumble under steady cannon fire. That day we lost a skirmish, and when we tried to attack one of the Mexican gun emplacements, Mexican foot soldiers were beginning to mass on the east side of the Alamo, from which our help would have to come. Our men were tired and cold. Guns were pointed at us from every direction. Several more men had come down with the fever. Word seeped into the fort from Bayard that General Santa Anna was riding around the battlefield himself. I'd like to draw a bead on that monkey, Colonel Crockett said. Everybody laughed a little at that, but it was a grim night. I remember the silence in the plaza as the men sat around the little campfires they had built, too tired to talk. In the women's quarters, the women and Lupe sat tearing Mrs. Dickinson's white revel petticoats into long strips. I thought we might need bandages, Mrs. Dickinson said to Captain Dickinson when he came to tell her good night. Poor little angel, Captain Dickinson said as he bent over the baby. Angelina's cheeks were streaked with tears, and once again she had cried herself to sleep.